Give up. You're already done. They mocked the elderly woman, but she silenced all the young seamstresses. Mrs. Margaret Johnson held firmly onto her old sewing case as she walked through the streets of downtown Manhattan. At 82 years old, she had lost everything after the textile factory where she worked for 50 years closed its doors, leaving her without a pension and with only her skills in her hands. It was then that she saw the advertisement in the newspaper she found on the park bench. Elegance Atelier, the most prestigious fashion house in the region, was looking for a new head seamstress. The competition would be that afternoon, and Margaret knew that this was her last chance to get a decent job. As she pushed the glass door of the atelier, the sound of sewing machines filled her ears like a familiar symphony. 3 young women worked concentrated at their tables, their modern clothes contrasting with the classic environment of the place. "Excuse me," said Margaret, approaching the reception. "I came for the head seamstress position competition." Ashley, a 28-year-old designer with perfectly straight hair, looked up and chuckled softly. Her 2 colleagues, Jennifer and Brittany, also stopped what they were doing. "Ma'am, are you sure?" asked Ashley, looking Margaret up and down. "This competition is for professionals, up-to-date ones." Jennifer, the youngest of the 3 at just 25, pointed to a small sign on the wall. "It says right there, see, only candidates with knowledge of modern sewing technologies." "Give up, you're already done," said Brittany, 30 years old, without even looking properly at Margaret. "This is no place for old techniques." Margaret adjusted her prescription glasses and observed the environment. The machines were modern, the fabrics shone under the LED lights, and everything seemed like it came out of a decor magazine. Even so, she recognized the essence of the place where she always felt at home. "I would like to try," she said with a firm but polite voice. The 3 young women exchanged mocking looks. Ashley made a gesture as if she were being generous. "All right, Auntie, but when Mrs. Elizabeth arrives and sees that you can't even turn on the machine properly, don't say we didn't warn you." Margaret headed to the farthest table, where there was a sewing machine that was clearly older than the others. It was a Singer from the 70s, similar to the one she had used for decades at the factory. She opened her case and organized her tools: hand-sharpened scissors, a tape measure yellowed with time, and small objects that the young women couldn't identify. "Look at her equipment," whispered Jennifer to her colleagues, prompting a new round of giggles. The first test began when Elizabeth Thompson, the owner of the atelier, arrived carrying a pile of fabrics. She was a 55-year-old woman, grey hair tied in an elegant bun, who built her business from scratch after her divorce 20 years ago. "Well, girls, you have 3 hours to create a piece that represents modern elegance," announced Elizabeth, distributing the fabrics. "The winner will be our new head seamstress with a salary of $4,000 per month." Elizabeth stopped when she saw Margaret at the back table, and her expression changed. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but this competition is for professionals. The reception is right over there." "She wants to participate," said Ashley, barely containing her laughter. "We told her it was better not to try, but she insisted." Elizabeth observed Margaret for a few seconds. There was something in the determined look of the lady that made her hesitate. "Well, if you're sure." Elizabeth handed a dark purple fabric to Margaret, the least noble one that was left. The young women received imported fabrics: Italian silk for Ashley, French linen for Jennifer, and Chinese satin for Brittany. While they examined their pieces with satisfaction, Margaret merely ran her hand over the purple fabric as if greeting an old friend. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now continuing. The competition officially began at 2 in the afternoon. The young women turned on their modern machines that made perfect automatic stitches. Ashley had already designed her pattern on the computer. Jennifer used an app to calculate measurements, and Brittany photographed every step to document her process. Margaret, meanwhile, just looked at the fabric for a few minutes, as if listening to a conversation only she could hear. Then, without making any sketches or taking measurements, she began to cut. "She didn't even make a pattern," commented Jennifer, incredulous. "How will she know if the measurements are right?" "Let her figure it out," replied Ashley, focused on her own work. "When it goes wrong, she'll give up herself." Margaret's first stitches came out crooked, making the young women laugh even louder. The old machine seemed to resist her commands, and the initial result was visibly imperfect compared to the work of the other contestants. Elizabeth, who was observing everything from her glass-walled office, almost interrupted the competition to dismiss Margaret. But something about the woman's posture, the way she wasn't shaken by the laughter, made Elizabeth decide to let her continue. During the first hour, the differences became even more evident. While the young women created technically perfect pieces, Margaret seemed to be just experimenting, doing and redoing the same stitches. "Mum, why is there a grandma here in the atelier?" asked Emily, Elizabeth's teenage daughter, who had arrived from school and entered the atelier looking for her mother. "She's participating in the competition," replied Elizabeth, without much enthusiasm. Emily, a 16-year-old girl who had always shown interest in her mother's work, approached Margaret's table. Unlike the designers, the teenager was fascinated watching the woman's movements. "How do you do that without a pattern?" asked Emily, genuinely curious. Margaret smiled for the first time since she arrived. "My dear, when you've worked with fabric for 60 years, it tells you what it wants to become." 60 years. Emily's eyes widened. "I started at 15 at the St. Benedict factory over in Williamsburg. I did everything. Formal wear, uniforms, party dresses. Each fabric has its own personality, you know." Ashley, who overheard the conversation, rolled her eyes. "Oh, sure, fabric with personality. How old-fashioned." But Emily remained interested. "And where did you learn?" "From my grandmother, Grandma Dorothy. She sewed for the wealthy families in the neighborhood. She used to say that sewing is like a family recipe. You don't learn just by reading. You have to feel it with your hands." During the second hour of the competition, a problem arose. Brittany, trying to rush her work, tore the Chinese satin at a crucial point of the piece. The delicate fabric didn't forgive the sudden movement, and an ugly line cut right through what was supposed to be the neckline. "No!" shouted Brittany, desperate. "My fabric tore." Jennifer and Ashley looked at their colleague with a mixture of pity and competitive relief. With one less contestant, their chances increased. "Is there any extra fabric?" Brittany asked Elizabeth. "Unfortunately not. Each of you received exactly what you needed," replied Elizabeth, checking her watch. "There are still 2 hours left." Brittany looked around, desperate. It was then that Margaret got up from her table, picked up a purple scrap left over from her cutting, and approached the young woman. "Here, dear, maybe this will help." Brittany looked at the purple scrap, then at Margaret, then at her colleagues. The color didn't match her original project, but it was her only option. Thank you," she murmured, genuinely surprised by the kindness. "Why did you do that?" asked Emily to Margaret, when the lady returned to her table. "She's competing against you." Margaret adjusted her glasses and smiled. "My dear, real competition isn't about tearing others down. It's about showing your very best," Ashley scoffed. "What an outdated philosophy. In the real world, you do whatever it takes to win." But Brittany, who had returned to work trying to incorporate the purple fabric into her project, grew thoughtful. She had never received help from a competitor, especially from someone she had treated poorly. As the afternoon wore on, something strange began to happen. Margaret's machine, which initially seemed to resist, now worked like an extension of her hands. The stitches that once came out crooked gained a rhythm of their own, creating patterns the young women couldn't identify. "What kind of stitch is that?" asked Jennifer, trying to peek at Margaret's work. "I've never seen that pattern," admitted Ashley, also curious. Margaret discreetly covered her piece. "They're techniques my grandmother taught me. Every sewing family had their secrets." "Secrets?" Emily approached again, fascinated. "For example, there's a stitch for fabrics that have memory," explained Margaret without stopping her work. "You make a special fold that makes the fabric always return to the right place, even after many washes." "Is that even possible?" even Elizabeth asked, who had drawn near. "Of course not," said Ashley, skeptical. "There's nothing like that in modern techniques." But Margaret just smiled and continued working. Her piece was taking shape in a way that defied the logic of conventional techniques. The purple fabric, which initially seemed ordinary, came to life under her hands. In the third hour, Elizabeth announced that there were only 30 minutes left until the end of the contest. The young women panicked, trying to finish their pieces in the remaining time. It was then that Margaret's machine began making strange noises, first a low creak, then a sound as if something were jamming. "I think her machine broke down," commented Jennifer, relieved. "That's all we needed," sighed Elizabeth. "That singer is from the time I set up the atelier. It should have been retired long ago." Margaret stopped sewing and listened to the machine's noises like a doctor listening to a patient's heart. Then, calmly, she opened her case and took out some tools the young women had never seen. "Wow, what old tools," murmured Brittany. With precise movements, Margaret unscrewed part of the machine, adjusted some internal parts, and put everything back together in less than 5 minutes. When she turned it on again, the singer worked better than before. "How did you learn to fix a machine?" asked Emily, impressed. "At the factory, we had to keep the equipment running ourselves. There wasn't a technician to call all the time. You learn to listen to what the machine is telling you." Ashley tried to maintain her superior posture, but she was secretly impressed. All her modern machines came with warranties and technical support. She had never thought about how they worked on the inside. With 15 minutes left, Jennifer realized she had miscalculated the measurements for her piece. The dress she was creating would be too big for the presentation mannequin. "There's no time to redo it," she said, nervous. "Try to adjust it on the side," suggested Ashley, but she herself was struggling against the clock to finish the details of her own piece. Margaret, who overheard the conversation, looked at Jennifer. "May I make a suggestion?" Jennifer hesitated. Accepting help from the older competitor hurt her pride, but desperation spoke louder. "What kind of suggestion?" "If you make an inverted pleat here on the side," Margaret pointed to a specific spot on the dress, "and adjust the seam with a secure stitch here in the back, you can reduce 2 sizes without losing the fit." Jennifer looked where Margaret had indicated. The solution was so simple that she felt foolish for not having thought of it before. "Why are you helping me?" asked Jennifer, genuinely confused. "Because sewing isn't about competing, dear. It's about creating beauty. And you have talent. You just need to trust yourself more." Jennifer followed Margaret's suggestion and managed to adjust her piece perfectly. As she worked, she reflected on how she had judged the older woman just by her age. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps those of us who are just starting out. Now continuing. With 5 minutes left, all 4 women were putting the finishing touches on their creations. Ashley had created a modern blazer with geometric details. Jennifer was finishing an elegant midi dress. Brittany had managed to transform her accident into an interesting design by mixing the satin with the purple scrap. And Margaret was creating something that nobody could quite define. "Time's up," announced Elizabeth. "Please prepare your pieces for presentation." The young women hung their creations on the mannequins with visible pride. Each piece demonstrated refined technique and knowledge of current fashion trends. Margaret, in turn, held her piece in her hands. It was a purple dress that seemed simple at first glance, but as she moved it, the pleats and seams created unique visual effects. The fabric seemed to have a life of its own. "Now let's move on to the presentations," said Elizabeth. "Ashley, please begin." Ashley presented her blazer with the confidence of someone who knew all the current fashion trends. She explained the minimalist influences, the use of modern proportions, and how the piece would be perfect for the contemporary executive woman. "Excellent work, Ashley," praised Elizabeth. "You clearly master current techniques." Jennifer presented her dress, explaining how she had used sustainability references in fashion, making use of every inch of the fabric. Her presentation was confident and well-founded. Brittany, still nervous about the accident, explained how she had turned the problem into a solution, creating an interesting contrast between the 2 different fabrics. Creativity in adversity. "I liked it," commented Elizabeth. When it was Margaret's turn, a strange silence fell over the atelier. The older woman approached the mannequin, dressed it in her creation, and took a step back. The dress completely transformed the environment. The pleats settled organically, creating a drape that seemed impossible for ordinary fabric. As the light hit from different angles, almost invisible embroidered details were revealed. How did you achieve this effect? Asked Elizabeth, genuinely impressed. It's a technique my grandmother called living seam, explained Margaret. You work by respecting the natural weave of the fabric, following the threads instead of fighting against them. The secret is patience. Emily approached the dress and gently touched the fabric. It feels like it's breathing. In a sense it is, smiled Margaret. When you sew this way, the fabric maintains its natural elasticity. It adapts to the wearer's body instead of forcing the body to adapt to it. Ashley also came closer, studying the details up close. But how did you do these embroideries? They hardly show, but when the light hits... They're threads the same color as the fabric, worked in different thicknesses. It creates texture without using contrasting colors. It's a technique my grandmother learned from the embroiderers in the countryside. Jennifer touched one of the seams. And this stitch? I've never seen anything like it. Double cross stitch. It's stronger than a regular seam, but almost invisible. My grandmother used to say that good sewing is the kind that doesn't show. Elizabeth examined the piece with an expert eye. In 20 years running the atelier, she had rarely seen something so technically perfect and artistically impressive at the same time. Where did you learn these techniques? Asked Elizabeth. From my grandmother Dorothy, as I said. She used to sew for the families on the Upper East Side in the 50s. Back then, there weren't machines that did everything automatically. You needed to know every type of stitch for every type of fabric. But why have I never seen these techniques anywhere? Insisted Ashley. Margaret sighed. Because when automatic machines arrived, people thought manual technique was a thing of the past. The older women who knew retired and didn't pass the knowledge along. Each took their secrets with them. A respectful silence fell over the atelier. The young women began to realize they had mocked someone carrying decades of knowledge they hadn't even known existed. Mrs. Margaret, said Brittany, ashamed, I want to apologize for how we treated you. We didn't know. Didn't know what, dear? Asked Margaret gently. That you were, I don't know, a master. Someone who knows so many things we can't even imagine. I'm no different from you, replied Margaret. I just had more time to learn. And to make mistakes, too. You have talent, you just need more experience. Jennifer approached. Could you teach us some of these techniques? Why would we teach you? Interrupted Ashley, still resisting. We're competitors. Margaret looked at Ashley patiently. Honey, do you think if I teach you what I know, I'll lose something? Well, yes, Ashley replied uncertainly. Knowledge is the only thing in the world that grows when you share it. If I teach you a technique, I still know it, and now you know it too. So I lost nothing, and the world gained one more person who knows how to make something beautiful. Emily, who had been quietly observing everything, finally spoke. Mom, I think we found more than a head seamstress. Elizabeth, who had been mentally evaluating each presentation, agreed with her daughter. Mrs. Margaret, you are clearly the winner of the contest. The position is yours. But Margaret shook her head. Thank you, Elizabeth, but I cannot accept. What do you mean? Asked Elizabeth, surprised. These girls have a lot of talent and know modern techniques I wouldn't even dream of learning. It would be unfair for me to take their place. But you are clearly the most qualified, insisted Elizabeth. I'm more experienced, that's different. They just need an opportunity to grow. Ashley looked at Margaret with a confused expression. But why are you giving up the position? Because job positions are for those who need to build a career, not for those who have already had theirs. But I have a counter-proposal, Elizabeth. What kind of counter-proposal? What if instead of a head seamstress you had a training program? I could come a few times a week, teach the old techniques I know, and they teach me the modern techniques I don't know. Elizabeth considered the proposal. Go on. You would pay a salary to one of your employees to act as head seamstress and pay me as a technical consultant. Everyone wins. You have a more qualified team. They learn new things, and I have an income without needing to work full-time. And who would be the head seamstress? Asked Jennifer. Margaret looked at the three young women. That Elizabeth will decide based on what she saw today. But may I give my opinion? Please, said Elizabeth. Ashley has the most solid technical knowledge and masters current trends. Jennifer has creativity and knows how to improvise in a pinch. Brittany has resilience and can turn problems into solutions. Any of the three could be an excellent head seamstress, depending on what you need most in the atelier. The three young women exchanged glances. Margaret had managed to identify each one's strengths in just one afternoon, while they had spent all their time trying to diminish each other. "But if we all work together," said Ashley, still processing the idea, "won't we keep competing?" "Healthy competition is good," replied Margaret. "The problem isn't competing, it's wanting to win by destroying others. You can challenge yourselves to be better without sabotaging each other." Elizabeth was thoughtful for a few minutes. Margaret's proposal made sense on many levels. She would gain not just one more qualified employee, but an entire, better-trained team. "I accept the proposal," announced Elizabeth. "But I'll make some modifications. I want all three of you to keep working here. Ashley will be the official head seamstress, Jennifer will be responsible for creative development, and Brittany will handle production and problem-solving." "And me?" asked Margaret. "You will be our technical supervisor. You'll come 3 times a week to train the team and develop new products that blend tradition and modernity." The young women fell silent, processing how the day had completely changed their perspectives. "Mrs. Margaret," said Jennifer, "I have a question that's been burning inside me." "Go ahead, dear. Why were you looking for a job if you know so much? You could have opened your own atelier." Margaret sighed, and for the first time seemed truly tired. "Because after the factory closed, I was left without a pension. My house is still being paid off. I need to pay for expensive medicine, and I no longer have the age or energy to start a business from scratch." "The factory closed without paying the pension?" asked Elizabeth, outraged. "St. Benedict Textile, I worked there 50 years since I was 15. When it closed last year, we found out the owner had embezzled the pension money. We long-time employees were left with nothing." Emily approached Margaret. "That's so unfair." "That's life, my dear. Sometimes you lose, sometimes you win. The important thing is not to give up." "And your family?" asked Brittany. "Do you have children?" "I had a daughter, Sarah, but she passed away 10 years ago. Cancer. She was a teacher, like her father. She always said she would follow a different path than mine." The atelier fell silent. The young women finally understood why Margaret had been so generous with them, even when treated poorly. She had faced real losses, not just professional competition. "Is that why you helped us?" asked Ashley, her voice softer. "Even though we were rude. I helped because you reminded me of Sarah at your age. She was also ambitious, talented, a bit impatient. She always wanted to show she was better than others to prove her worth." "And did she succeed?" asked Jennifer. "She achieved much more than that. She managed to be a good person, and in the end, that's worth more than any job position." Elizabeth, who had been observing the whole conversation, made a decision. "Mrs. Margaret, I want to make a different proposal." "What kind of proposal?" "How about we create a special product line? Elegance tradition. Pieces that blend your old techniques with the girls' modern design. You would be a minority partner, with a share in the profits." Margaret's eyes widened. "A partner? Why not? You have unique knowledge, they have energy and modern know-how. Together you can create something nobody else in the market has." Ashley stepped forward. "I would love to learn those techniques, you know, seriously. And I want to better understand how to work respecting the fabric instead of forcing it," added Jennifer. "I can be the bridge between the old techniques and the modern machines," offered Brittany. "Adapt the traditional stitches for current equipment." Margaret looked at the 3 young women, then at Elizabeth, then at Emily, who was smiling encouragingly. It was more than she had dreamed of when she left home that morning. "But I don't even know how to be a partner in anything," admitted Margaret. "We'll learn together," said Elizabeth. "You teach us sewing, we teach you administration." Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now continuing. 2 weeks later, Elegance's atelier had been transformed. Margaret came every Tuesday, Thursday and Saturday morning, always carrying her tool case and a new technique to teach. On the first official day of working together, she brought a common cotton fabric and asked each of the young women to create a basic piece using only their usual techniques. Now I'll show you what happens when we apply my grandmother's techniques, said Margaret, picking up an identical fabric. In 2 hours, she had created a blouse that looked like it was made from much more expensive fabric. The fit was perfect, the seams invisible, and the finish impeccable. How? Asked Ashley, comparing her piece with Margaret's. It's the same fabric. The difference is in how you work with it. I'll teach you. In the following weeks, Margaret taught stitches the young women had never seen before. The cloud stitch, which created volume without using padding. The memory stitch, which made the fabric always return to its original shape. The invisible stitch, which joined pieces without leaving a trace of the seam. In return, the young women taught Margaret about modern technologies, how to use apps to calculate fabric consumption, how to create size gradations on the computer, how to use overlock machines for professional finishes. "Mrs. Margaret," said Jennifer at the end of the 3rd week, "I have a confession to make." "Tell me, dear." "I always thought old techniques were inferior to modern ones. Now I realize they're just different, and sometimes superior. And I always thought modern machines took the soul out of sewing," admitted Margaret. "But you showed me that the soul is in the person using the machine, not in the machine itself." Ashley, who had been the most resistant at first, became the most dedicated student. "You know what impresses me most? How these techniques make the work last longer." "How so?" asked Brittany. "The pieces I make using the stitches Mrs. Margaret taught are more durable, and the fit stays perfect even after several washes." Margaret smiled. "My grandmother used to say, 'Clothes made in haste last briefly. Clothes made with patience last a lifetime.'" The first piece of the Elegance Tradition line was a blazer that combined the modern cut created by Ashley with the traditional stitches taught by Margaret. When Elizabeth put the piece on display in the window, with a sign explaining the story behind the techniques, the reaction was immediate. "Elizabeth, what blazer is that in the window?" asked Catherine Wilson, a regular customer. "It looks different from anything I've ever seen." Elizabeth proudly explained the partnership between Margaret and the young designers, about the traditional techniques being applied to contemporary design. "I want to order one just like it," said Catherine immediately, "and I want to meet this lady who knows these old techniques." Within weeks, the Elegance Tradition line became the most sought-after product in the atelier. Customers came not only to buy, but to hear Margaret's stories about the golden age of American sewing. "Mrs. Margaret," said a customer, Barbara Miller, 70 years old, "you remind me of my mother. She also sewed for others." "Where did your mother sew?" asked Margaret, interested. "Right here in the area. She was known as Mrs. Teresa from 5th Avenue. She made dresses for the Upper East Side madams." Margaret stopped sewing. "Mrs. Teresa? Teresa Miller?" "Yes." "Did you know my mother? Did I know her?" Margaret laughed, moved. "Your mother was the one who taught me the star stitch. My grandmother and she had been friends for decades." From that meeting on, Margaret began to discover that there was a whole network of descendants of traditional seamstresses scattered throughout the city. Many had kept old pieces made by their mothers and grandmothers, true treasures of lost techniques. "Elizabeth, I have an idea," Margaret said one day. "What if we created a project to recover these ancient techniques? How so? We could invite these ladies to come here and tell their stories and show the pieces they've kept. Document the techniques before they're lost forever." Emily, who was always around absorbing everything, got excited. "We could make a documentary for the school project and exhibit the old pieces alongside the modern ones," suggested Jennifer. "Show the evolution of Brazilian sewing." The project Thread Memories was born like that, casually, from a conversation between an 80-year-old seamstress and 3 young designers who had learned to value the knowledge of previous generations. On the day of the first exhibition, the atelier was packed. Mrs. Barbara came with dresses that her mother had made in the 60s. Mrs. Florence brought a hand-embroidered tablecloth that took 3 years to complete. Mr. Anthony, the only male tailor in the area, showed his tailoring techniques that he learned from his Italian father. "I never imagined so many people would be interested in old techniques," commented Ashley to Margaret. "It's just that everyone has a seamstress in the family, dear. Mother, grandmother, aunt, sister. It's part of our history." Among the audience was Michael Roberts, a journalist from the lifestyle section of a major New York newspaper. He had gone just out of curiosity, but was fascinated by the stories. "May I interview you?" he asked Margaret. "I think our readers would be interested in this story." The interview was published on a Friday under the title, "The Seamstress Who Saved Century-Old Techniques from Oblivion." The article told the story of Margaret, her struggle after the factory closed, and how a contest that seemed lost turned into a movement to value tradition. The following Saturday, a line formed at the door of the atelier. People came from distant neighborhoods to meet Margaret and see the traditional techniques being applied. "Mrs. Margaret, there's a lady at the door who says she's your cousin," announced Emily. Margaret ran to the entrance and came face to face with Marilyn, a cousin she hadn't seen in 15 years. "Marilyn, how did you find me?" "I saw the article in the newspaper. You've become famous, cousin," laughed Marilyn. "And look, I brought something that will interest you." Marilyn opened an old box and took out a carefully preserved navy blue dress. "Remember this dress?" Margaret took the piece in her hands with reverence. "It's the dress our grandmother made for Aunt Rose's wedding. I kept it all these years. I thought you'd like to see it." The dress was a masterpiece. Every stitch, every detail demonstrated a level of skill that Margaret recognized immediately. "Girls, come see this," called Margaret. Ashley, Jennifer, and Brittany approached and fell silent observing the piece. "This dress is at least 70 years old," said Margaret, "and look at its condition." "How is that possible?" asked Jennifer, delicately touching the fabric. "Technique, quality materials, and most importantly, love for what you do. My grandmother took 6 months to make this dress." "6 months?" Brittany's eyes widened. "She worked on it 1 hour a day, after housework and the fields. Every stitch was made with the bride's happiness in mind." Elizabeth, who was watching the scene, had an inspiration. "Mrs. Margaret, what if we recreate this dress?" "How so?" "A challenge. You and the girls try to reproduce this dress using both old and modern techniques. We see what we can learn in the process." Margaret looked at the young women. "Are you in?" "Of course," replied Ashley immediately. "But it might take months." "And what's the problem?" smiled Margaret. "The best things in life take time anyway." The project to recreate the grandmother's dress became the challenge that definitively united the team. Every detail was studied, every technique researched and tested. Margaret brought old sewing books she had kept from her factory days. The young women researched in digital fashion archives. Together they created complete documentation of the process. "Look what I found," said Jennifer, showing an old photo. "This type of embroidery appeared in several fashion magazines from the 50s, and I found a variation of this stitch here in Grandma's book," added Margaret. "She called it the rose stitch." During the 3 months it took to recreate the dress, the atelier transformed into a historical fashion research center. Design students came to intern, journalists documented the process, and clients placed orders inspired by the techniques being revived. "Mrs. Margaret," said Brittany one day, "I want to tell you something." "Go ahead, dear." "My mother always wanted me to learn to sew with my grandmother, but I thought it was a waste of time, an old lady thing. Now I regret it so much. Why don't you call your grandmother and schedule a visit? She passed away last year. She took all her secrets with her." Margaret stopped what she was doing and looked at Brittany. "Dear, I'm sure your grandmother would be very proud to see what you've become." "You think so?" "I'm sure, and you know why? Because you're honoring her memory every time you learn a new technique and teach it to someone else. Her knowledge didn't die. It's alive in you." At that moment, Brittany understood something that would change her perspective forever. She wasn't just learning to sew, she was connecting with generations of women who came before her. "Mrs. Margaret," said Ashley, "can I ask a personal question?" "Of course." "Did you never want to give up? Did you never? When the factory closed, when you lost everything?" Margaret stopped sewing and became thoughtful. "Many times, dear. There were nights I cried thinking I had lost my purpose in life." "And what made you change your mind?" "One day, walking down the street, I passed a store window and saw a horrible dress being sold for an absurd price. The stitches were crooked, the fit was terrible, but it had a famous designer label. And then? I thought, as long as I'm alive, I can't let people forget how things should be done properly. Sewing is an art, you know. And art can't die, Jennifer approached. Is that why you entered the contest? That's why I entered the contest. It wasn't about getting a job. It was about not letting what my grandmother, my mother, and I learned over decades die. And you succeeded, said Elizabeth, who had just arrived. Not only did you save the techniques, but you taught them to a new generation. The recreated dress was finished on a Thursday in December. When Margaret made the last stitch, everyone fell silent observing the result. It was identical to the original, but at the same time completely unique. The traditional techniques had been perfected with modern knowledge, creating a piece that honored the past while embracing the present. I think your grandmother would be proud, said Marilyn, who had followed the entire process. Our grandmother, corrected Margaret, smiling, and I'm sure she would be. On the day of the official launch of the Elegance Tradition collection, the atelier organized a special fashion show. Models of all ages presented the pieces, from teenagers to ladies in their 70s. Margaret was invited to open the show by presenting the recreated dress. When she entered the makeshift runway at the atelier, wearing the dress that had taken her 3 months to recreate, everyone present stood up in applause. This dress, Margaret said into the microphone, represents more than a piece of clothing. It represents continuity, the knowledge that passes from one generation to the next, proof that tradition and modernity can go hand in hand. Ashley, Jennifer, and Brittany stepped onto the stage to join Margaret. 6 months ago, Ashley said, I thought I knew everything about sewing. I discovered I knew nothing, or rather I knew only half of it. Mrs. Margaret taught us that experience isn't a synonym for being outdated, Jennifer added. It's a synonym for wisdom. And that true competition is about surpassing yourself every day, Brittany concluded. Margaret looked at the 3 young women who had become much more than co-workers. They were the continuation of a tradition she had thought would die with her. When I was young like you, Margaret said, my grandmother told me something I only understand now. She said, Margaret, you don't own the knowledge you have. You're just its guardian until it's time to pass it on. And has the time come? Asked Emily, who had also stepped onto the stage. It came and went, Margaret smiled. Now this knowledge belongs to you, and when your time comes, you'll pass it to the next generation. 6 months after that contest, Margaret had thought she would lose. She was sitting at her sewing machine in the atelier, not as an employee, but as a partner and mentor. Ashley had become a respected designer, combining modern techniques with traditional stitches. Jennifer developed a sustainable clothing line that made use of every thread of fabric. Brittany created an online course teaching how to adapt ancient techniques for modern machines. Mrs. Margaret, said Elizabeth, a special order has come in. What kind of order? A wedding dress. The client wants it made entirely with traditional techniques, and she wants you to personally supervise every stitch. Margaret smiled. Wedding dresses had always been her specialty at the factory. It was the kind of piece that required not just technique, but love and hope sewn into every detail. I accept, she said, but on one condition. What? I want Ashley, Jennifer, and Brittany to make the dress with me, each contributing what they do best. Why? Asked Elizabeth. Because when I leave this life, I want them to know how to make a wedding dress that will last forever. It's the most important technique I can teach. That afternoon, as Margaret organized her tools to begin another lesson with the young women, she thought of her daughter Sarah. If she were alive, she would be Ashley's age. Perhaps she would have followed a different path, as she always wanted. But Margaret was sure Sarah would be proud to see how the family's knowledge had found a new home. Ready for another lesson, Mrs. Margaret? Asked Jennifer. Always ready, dear. Always ready. And so in the atelier that had once rejected her for her age, Margaret Johnson continued her mission of keeping alive a tradition that could have been lost forever. Proving that experience doesn't age, it only matures, like a fine wine that gets better with time. End of story. Now tell us what you thought of this story of perseverance and wisdom. Do you know someone in your family who also preserved traditional knowledge? Share your experiences and reflections in the comments about how important it is to value the wisdom of our elders. Mrs. Margaret taught us that it's never too late to start over, and that true success comes when we share our knowledge with others. Thank you for joining us on this exciting journey.